Anything else about the history?
What happened to the marvelous golden pages?
Oh, yeah. Merle and I took them back. Because they were so special and righteous that, you know, they couldn't be left here on the earth for people to steal. So,
But the other thing is, no one ever saw the golden plates of Joseph Smith.
Yeah.
He interpreted them behind a wall, so no one.
yeah, no one else ever really saw them. He had an incident where where they were covered with a blanket or something, and people felt them through the blanket. The other thing is that I have seen a replica of these plates done by somebody who wanted to make a point. And there's a famous story about Joseph being chased through the woods by people who wanted to get their hands on them, and he was carrying these plates. I have tried to lift, you know, even if they were a combination of gold and some other metal. I mean, they weighed, I don't know if any 300 pounds or something. They were, you know, no one person could have possibly carried them. But, you know, there's a disconnect when you're raised as a Mormon, or when you're a convert who's found the church because your life's a mess and this looks like something better. And there's just a disconnect in your brain that goes on, and it's a dissonance that goes on. And I call it the split, you know, I call it my closet. For 25 years, as I began, you know, to get these little hints that something wasn't quite right here, I would just, you know, and I would read and I would study, and then because I had 7 kids and I had a difficult marriage, and I just had everything I could possibly do, and my whole family was involved, I would just put it in this closet, you know, slam the door on it. And I've talked to, you know, hundreds of ex-Mormons now who just say finally that door bursts open at some point. It's usually at some pivotal point in your life. For some reason, it bursts open and it all comes tumbling out.
I was just wondering if you are going to be running out of time, if it would be more what the group would be interested in, and if you would be able to do it, to present the part about the process, your life in the church, leaving the church, the social aspects.
I will.
Because
Let me get to the basics of the church doctrine that I think are important for you to know about Mormonism, and then I do want to talk about that because it's a very important piece. You know, because I'm sure there's probably a lot of people here who have also left religions of their childhood and so forth. The basic tenet of the Mormon church that underlies everything, which now they're trying to pull away from because the fundamentalist Christians hate this, is this statement: as man is, God once was. As God is, man may become. Basic Mormon doctrine is that God himself was once a man, went through an earthly experience of some kind, and then eventually progressed to become a God. And that we as men, if we learn the right things and obey the right laws, will eventually go to a special place in heaven. Not just heaven broadly, but a very special place in heaven, and will eventually learn enough and become enough to become a God ourselves and create rules ourselves. This drives other Christians nuts, and the church is now pulling away from that. And Gordon B. Hinckley, who's the present prophet, was interviewed by Larry King a few years ago and was asked about that particular statement, and he completely pulled away from it and said, "Oh, we don't know much about that." Those were his words, literally. And I mean, that is a central tenet of Mormon doctrine. Some of you know about temples. The temples are there because there are certain ordinances which they teach cannot be done anywhere else but in the temple, and only by certain people who are given this very special authority from God to do it. And that includes marriages for eternity, not just for time, but for eternity. And in the process of that marriage, any child that is born to you is then part of your family for eternity. And the church does perform what they call proxy baptisms and marriages for people who have died. The reason the temples exist for the most part is for Mormons to go in there and do this proxy work for thousands and millions of people. That's why they do genealogy, to gather names. They gather names all over the world. There's been a scandal recently because they got a hold of the register of all the Holocaust victims and began to baptize all the Jews that had been killed in the Holocaust, and the Jewish people began to hear about this and protested. The church promised to quit doing it, and they did not quit. 3 years later, another protest, they promised to quit, it did not quit. Recently, they have finally gone in and removed all the names that they had, but according to their doctrine, of course, that doesn't really matter because they were baptized. So the thing is that they believe that in the next life, a person can then agree to accept this ordinance or not. They still have their free will. But that work has to be done on earth. It can't be done in the next life. It's all bizarre. And I used to go all the time and do it myself. There's multiple contradictions in the Mormon scriptures between the Bible and the Book of Mormon. They have two other scriptures. If you're a scholar and you get into them, you see all the contradictions. Most Mormons do not. They see sometimes the contradictions and then they just find a way to live with it. I began to read, as I say, and I knew for, I think I knew for quite a while before I left the church that I didn't believe it anymore. But it wasn't until I finally divorced and my children were grown and out of the house that I finally got the courage to do it. And it's an interesting thing how these things happen in your life. I was still going to church. I was still teaching in the women's auxiliary once a month. And my last day as a attending Mormon, I actually taught a class in the women's auxiliary. And while I was preparing that lesson, I just can remember thinking, how can I be authentic, teach what's in this lesson, not lie, I lived that for so many years, just trying to live it, trying to be authentic, getting in trouble at church, losing friends if I had raised my hand in class and asked anything that was controversial. And I quit that lesson that day, I ended it, and I walked down the hall. I can remember it as though it was yesterday. This was about 8 years ago. And it was like I had a hand on my back, and I just went out the door, and I knew I wasn't coming back. It was that abrupt. And the next day I took all my teaching materials, put them in a plastic bag, took them back to the church, put them on the porch, and left them. Then there's a process that goes on. But the problem was I had raised all my children to be extremely devout. Both my sons had gone on missions. For the church was, is a rite of passage for young men in the church. All of my siblings, my father was so prominent in the church here in Portland. On both my mother and father's side, it goes back to the first couple of years of the Mormon church. That's how direct it is on both sides of my family. And all my cousins, I had my grandparents who lived in Idaho, my mom's parents, had 250 descendants by the time I was 10 years old. Mormons have a lot of kids. And, hundreds of relatives are devout Mormons, and of course some who weren't. But I knew when I left that it was going to be devastating to my family. And so I left it very quietly. I just quit going. Within a few months, most of my children began, who were almost for the most part married and had their own families, realized that mom wasn't going to church anymore. And at that point, every single one of them, except Kathleen here, who had left long before me, came to me either by phone or in person and said to me, "Mother, if you ever speak to our children about the church, that will be the end of our relationship with you. You are never, ever to talk to our children about the church."
Your grandchildren?
My grandchildren. And I said, I promised them that I wouldn't, because I do respect that they are believers. They are devout. I taught them to be. I said I can't promise that when they're adults. I don't know what I'll do when those grandchildren are adults. And one child said to me, even if they're adults, if you ever speak to them. That's how, brainwashed